On the road with the Western Ag Network.
This week, Western Ag Network is on the road in Kansas City, Missouri for the 80th annual meeting of the National Association of Farm Broadcasting. And over those 8 decades, there's been quite a few presidents at the helm of the association, and joining us here today is one of those lucky individuals leading the organization. Joining us here today from Albany, Minnesota, Mr. Joe Gill with KASM or KASM. Is that how you say your call letters? Well, we're here in Kansas City, Joe, and I guess what's it been like serving as a leader on the board for NAFB, but also as president over this past year?
It's been interesting. It's also been an honor as well. It's an organization that you feel the tradition of it each and every day, or if you see a NAFB pin on a lapel. It's been a pleasure, a tradition, knowing the folks, like you stated, 80 years that have kind of come before you. You know, there's issues that come up that can be difficult. There's issues that are pretty easy to figure out. I think this year we've seen a mix.
Well, and I know for a fact that one of our big talking points in rural media, and of course for NAFB, is that the discussion around AM radio. I know for myself, I listen to AM radio every day, and that's not just because we're on AM and FM signals, it's because I know it's reliable. And yeah, I have Sirius, I listen to it, but I'm tuned in every single day to our local radio stations. And let's just talk about that threat, I guess, that we have seen from electric vehicles and lawmakers and those manufacturers wanting to remove AM radios from new vehicles. And actually, I should even point out, it's not just electric vehicles, it's just new vehicles in general.
I think last year at convention was the first time we saw this issue really surface and gain some momentum, and we got noticed as an organization. And also, strength is in numbers and collaboration. NAB has been a great source, some of our state broadcasting associations. And what it's stemming to really surrounds the electric vehicle push and not having AM radio in that dashboard. And therefore, this AM radio for every vehicle act would make it a regulation to have AM radio stay in the dashboard. And I think a lot of focus right now, momentum is in a positive situation. I think a lot of people play the what if game. If AM radio is today, is FM radio, and so on, what kind of precedent will that set?
And as we look at that too, obviously farms and ranchers, they tune in daily to their local farm broadcasters, but also just the aspect of when farmers and ranchers are 20 miles from town, 30, 40 miles from town, AM radio can truly be a lifeline. It's about safety as well.
On Wednesday morning, we heard from folks from FEMA, and they said still, yes, you can have online, you can have an app, you can have a cell phone, but there is no better reach than AM radio. You cannot reach that size of population with any other source.
Now, we have seen a little bit of success in some of these auto manufacturers actually reversing their decision. Was that Ford, am I correct? And Ford is deciding, yeah, we're going to keep those AM dials in those vehicles.
Yep, if I'm not mistaken, Toyota as well has decided to keep that in their vehicles. But right now the push is coming from a regulatory perspective, and I know nobody likes mandates, especially when it comes to agriculture, but there's such broad bipartisan support right now, and I think we've reached a mark where we can be positive. Will we see a decision this year? I don't think so. I think we did get a little heads up that it could come early in 2024.
Now, Joe, obviously back there in Minnesota, a little bit different commodities than maybe in Montana, a lot more dairy. I know you grew up on a dairy operation, but you were sharing with me, we talk a lot about what those calves are bringing back in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and all of our states that we cover across Western Ag Network country. But what was that dairy Angus cross average bringing for some of these brand new baby calves?
You know, it's unreal. We've seen this in our area with dairy where milk prices have been stagnant. Where can you see value added? I'd say every dairy to some point is incorporating Angus genetics. So you'll have an Angus Holstein cross calf. And we've seen calves, I know in the recent 2 weeks, topping out at $7.20 a head. Now this is a baby calf, 4 to 5 days old. And we've seen this trend. I've seen top prices in Wisconsin reach $800. I've talked to some of our livestock barn managers. I said, can we come out? How does that pencil push on those? And he says, in some scenarios, it works out. But for the dairy side of things, they're seeing a lot of added value by adding those Angus genetics in their dairy cattle.
That blows my mind. I might have to get into the business. Maybe not. Not the milking. I'm not tough enough for that. But Joe, any last thoughts you would just like to share with our audience across Western Ag Network and just what it's been like serving as president of NAFB?
Yeah, it's all about the members. So when I see yourself and Russell and the rest of the crew, you really got to appreciate what you do on a daily basis and talking about agriculture, sharing the story of the farmer and the rancher. They can't do it every day. You guys can do it, and it makes me proud to be a part of an organization with members such as your crew, and to represent everybody for a year, and hopefully to represent those in the future as well. I really look forward to it, and it's a privilege.
Well, Joe Gill, thanks for joining us here today. And for all of our friends out there, make sure and stay tuned in to the Western Ag Network social media channels, our radio dials, and of course our TV programs as well, as we have more conversations here on the road from the National Association of Farm Broadcasting Association 80th Annual Convention here in Kansas City, Missouri. Continuing our conversations this week in Kansas City, Missouri, as the National Association of Farm Broadcasting gathers for its 80th convention. We're talking with agricultural industry groups here this week, and a lot of moving parts happening out in our nation's capital this week, of course, with funding being the hot topic for federal agencies. Joining us here today from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association's D.C. office is Ethan Lane, the Vice President of Government Affairs. And Ethan, you're down here in KC talking with farm broadcasters from across the nation, and we're all following this very closely. Obviously, we saw an extension with that continuing resolution, passed just today. What does this mean for farmers and ranchers in terms of a farm bill and other funding mechanisms?
Well, given some of the challenges we've seen with the Freedom Caucus and with these kind of more fringe members of the House Republican Conference over the last month, getting this bill out of the House is a big deal. It sends it over to the Senate. It allows them to work their process. Hopefully it will reach the president's desk by that deadline at midnight on Friday night. And it will give the supply chain a little bit of certainty. I think that's been the concern for farmers and ranchers is what's next, right? I mean, we have that shutdown plan that was articulated back in September from USDA and the Department of Interior. We know their intent during a shutdown was and is to inflict as much pain on voters as possible so that they'll call their members of Congress and say, hey, you got to fix this. Certainly, with a senator in Montana like a congressman in Montana like Matt Rosendale, who's been actively engaged in some of that. Other members like Matt Gaetz, similar. The goal there being that their constituents call and say, you got to come to the table and fix this. Alleviating that concern, avoiding that, at least through the holidays, is a big win and gives us a little bit of time to kind of get these bills finished up, make sure that those funding mechanisms are done properly, and start looking towards next year's bills that they've got to get started with here in a few months.
Well, and obviously the Farm Bill expired at the end of September 2023 here this year, and there was a lot of hope initially that a new Farm Bill, the 2023 bill, could have been completed at this time.
Yeah.
Obviously, that is not the scenario right now. So what is this looking like as we look towards an extension of that Farm Bill and the work that needs to go in of actually drafting a Farm Bill for 2024, 2025, however that process may go?
Right. This extension gets this thing out of the current kind of toxic political climate that we're in Washington. And that's especially important for $1 trillion spending and authorization package, right? This is not a typical piece of legislation. That nutrition portion, which is 85% of that bill, highly contentious, hasn't really been talked about since the debt limit deal earlier this year. We keep reminding people there was still some fighting to be done, amongst the committees, regardless of whether Senator Stabenow, Chairwoman Stabenow, says she's done talking about that. House Republicans definitely are not. And so there's definitely some work left to be done there. We know there are drafts kind of at least conceptually done on both sides of the Hill. G.T. Thompson was for a while there, a week or so ago, trying to get some time in December to work through that bill. I think this is more realistic to have these next few months to work through that process. And I think everyone needs to kind of, be comfortable with the idea that 2 months before this presidential election may also be a bad time to do that. And if so, they may extend it again. And if that happens, it's not the first time it's happened. We've certainly seen the 2012 Farm Bill become the 2014 Farm Bill by the time it was done. You got to find that right window to land a jumbo jet this big. So hopefully they'll keep looking for those opportunities.
Well, there's definitely going to have to be a lot of compromise between the House and Senate, and pointing out that Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan is not seeking re-election, and I know she would like to retire with a farm bill passed. Do you think that may help in the negotiations, in the back and forth with some of these funding items?
It certainly should add some motivation for folks to come together and find some common ground. I think that you have participants here that are looking for compromise. The problem with the Farm Bill has never been the ag committees, right? It's never been the ag state members. It's the folks that don't deal with this on a regular basis in Congress, or who want to leverage that process for other reasons or have kind of ulterior motives that insert themselves into that equation at the point that it comes to the floor. So I have all the confidence in the world that the members of the ag committees in the House and Senate, R's and D's both, are going to continue their really good work on this product. It's about selling it to the rest of the body. And whether that deal, whether Chairwoman Stabenow and Chairman Thompson can cut a deal that makes sense, that's where their eyes are going to be. Is not on their committees. It's going to be on those other members.
Now, as we look to other news, especially the Endangered Species Act, more news out of the Biden administration this week in terms of grizzly bears up in the Northern Cascades ecosystems. You and I have talked about this in the past. Obviously, there's a lot of people against the reintroduction efforts, but just share a little more on what unraveled here this week in D.C.
Well, whenever you see the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service doing these reintroductions, right, whether it's Mexican gray wolves in Arizona, black-footed ferrets, grizzly bears, you're quite literally injecting cancer into rural communities. And I hate to be that sort of hyperbolic about it, but that's really what we're talking about here, right? You're putting this additional burden on communities that are already struggling to manage their resources. These bears, we know, would migrate into these areas on their own over time. And Congressman Newhouse made this comment to me a few weeks ago when we were talking about this issue. Someone used the term reintroduction, and he said, well, that implies they were there in the first place. That's not what this is. This is an introduction of grizzly bears into the North Cascades ecosystem. And that's incredibly frustrating for, I think, the producers that are in that area that then have to deal with extremely large apex predators being introduced into their backyard. We need to really take a look at how we can start to finally make some statutory changes to the Endangered Species Act. We in the cattle industry and anyone who's managing landscapes, being subject to this regulatory wave in and out with each administration is incredibly damaging to their ability to know what's next over the next couple of years. So I'm hopeful that the Hill will have some time over the next year or two to refocus on some statutory changes that can relieve a little pressure for producers.
And what are some of the cattlemen? Obviously, the Washington cattlemen, they just held their annual meeting. What's some of the work that NCBA is doing with them and along the other states that have grizzly bears like Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, to really bring awareness to this and help those Washington producers have a voice in this as well?
Well, it's really important because when the government sets up these comment periods, right? We know what happens. You have tens of thousands of people that live in condos in Salt Lake or in Seattle or in Denver that are weighing in on this that don't have to live with these predators as part of their daily lives. And helping the agencies understand and illustrating to the public the difference between a truly impacted stakeholder that is going to have to live with these animals and someone who thinks they're cool on TV is a really important distinction to be made as part of that process, and one that when they hold meetings on this kind of thing in urban areas, you kind of know what kind of voices you're going to get in the room. So any opportunity we can have to elevate those voices of folks that are actually going to be impacted and are going to carry this burden, that's job number one, and making sure that they're the ones whose voices are being considered as they move through this process.
Well, again, Ethan Lane, Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, join us here today. Thank you for taking a few moments to talk about a few of the several issues that NCBA works on day in, day out for cattlemen and women.
You got it.
Well, again, friends, we're going to continue to talk with more movers and shakers in agriculture this week in Kansas City as the National Association of Farm Broadcasting hosts its 80th convention here in Kansas City.
On the road with the Western Ag Network.